The warm glow of the early morning sun painted the city in soft hues of gold, but James Whittaker barely noticed. His driver navigated the sleek black car through the quiet streets, each turn bringing them closer to a destination James had never envisioned for himself. His gaze, cold and detached, settled on the infant cradled in a pristine white blanket beside him. The baby, barely a week old, was silent, as if sensing the chill in the man's heart. James was a man defined by precision and control. His wealth, accumulated through ruthless business deals and relentless ambition, was his shield against the world. For years, he had carefully curated a life of perfection, untouchable by scandal or sentiment. But this child, born with a visible congenital condition, had shattered that image. It wasn't the baby's fault, James reasoned, but fault didn't matter in the world he inhabited. Image did. "Here, sir," the driver said, his voice hesitant as the car slowed near a modest park. The area was deserted, save for the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. James nodded, his jaw tight. He opened the car door and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his polished shoes. His movements were deliberate as he reached for the child, cradling the bundle with an awkwardness that betrayed his discomfort. The baby stirred, emitting a soft whimper that made James falter for the briefest moment. His grip tightened, and he closed his eyes, trying to block out the surge of unease. "This is for the best," he told himself. A child like this deserved compassion, care, and love, things he wasn't capable of providing. Someone else would take the baby in, someone better suited for the task. He approached a bench near the edge of the park, his gaze sweeping over the surroundings to ensure they were alone. The baby's small face peeked out from the blanket, its innocent eyes wide and searching. James felt an unfamiliar pang in his chest, something uncomfortably close to guilt. He pushed the feeling aside, placing the child carefully on the bench. He lingered a moment longer than he intended, the weight of his decision pressing on him like a physical burden. The baby let out a soft coo, and for a fleeting second, James felt an irrational urge to pick it up and take it back to the car. But the rational part of him, honed through years of burying emotion under layers of logic, won out. James turned on his heel, walking briskly back to the waiting car. He didn't look back as he climbed inside and signaled for the driver to leave. The vehicle pulled away, the park disappearing into the distance. For the rest of the day, James buried himself in work, refusing to let his mind wander back to that morning. Meetings came and went, contracts were signed, and the steady hum of commerce filled his ears. Yet, beneath it all, a quiet unease gnawed at him, like a whisper he couldn't quite silence. That night, alone in his sprawling mansion, James poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. The lights below twinkled like stars, but they failed to bring him comfort. His mind, traitorous as it was, kept replaying the image of the baby's face, those wide, trusting eyes gazing up at him. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself, downing the whiskey in one gulp. He slammed the glass onto the table, the sharp sound echoing in the empty room. James prided himself on being a man of reason, not emotion. He had made the logical choice. So why did it feel like something inside him was fracturing? The next morning, the knock on his door was unexpected. James, still groggy from a restless night, tightened his robe as he descended the grand staircase. He opened the door to find two police officers standing on the marble steps, their expressions somber. Behind them, a woman held a baby wrapped in a white blanket. James's heart stopped. He recognized the child instantly. His mind raced as he searched for an explanation, an excuse, something to make this problem disappear. "Mr. Whittaker," one of the officers began, his tone firm but not unkind. "We need to speak with you about this child. He was found abandoned in a park early yesterday morning. DNA tests have confirmed he is your son." James's breath hitched. The world around him seemed to tilt, the polished floors and elegant furnishings blurring in his vision. He started, but no words came. For the first time in years, James Whittaker was utterly at a loss. The officer continued, his voice steady. "You'll need to come with us to discuss this matter further. In the meantime, arrangements have been made for the child's care." James's eyes flicked to the baby. It was asleep, its tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. That unfamiliar pang returned, sharper this time, cutting through his defenses. He wanted to refuse, to shut the door and retreat into the safety of his carefully constructed world. But he knew, deep down, that the past he had tried so hard to escape had finally caught up to him, and there would be no avoiding it now. James sat in stunned silence across from the two officers in his sprawling living room. The ornate furniture and gilded decor, symbols of his success, felt oppressively heavy in that moment. The baby, now awake and cradled in the arms of the woman who had accompanied the police, let out a small whimper. The sound pierced the tense atmosphere, drawing James's eyes toward the child once again. "You'll need to explain the circumstances," one of the officers said, his tone even. "Why was your child left unattended in the park?" James ran a hand through his neatly combed hair, his usual composure unraveling. His mind raced, desperate to construct a plausible excuse. But he could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, the unspoken judgment hanging in the air. Every word that came to mind felt hollow, insufficient. "I didn't," he began, but stopped abruptly. His throat tightened, and for the first time in years, he felt the sting of vulnerability. It was a mistake. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. The woman holding the baby, who had been silent until now, cleared her throat softly. She stepped forward, her expression kind but firm. "I'm Claire," she said. "I work with Child Protective Services. The baby was found early yesterday morning, alone on a park bench. He could have died of exposure if someone hadn't noticed him in time." James flinched at her words. He imagined the fragile life he had so callously dismissed, left to the mercy of the elements. For the first time since the ordeal began, the enormity of his actions began to sink in. Claire continued, her tone softening. "Mr. Whitaker, I understand this might not have been easy for you, but abandoning a child is not the answer. This baby deserves a chance. He deserves care, love, and stability." The baby let out a small cry, squirming in her arms. Without thinking, James reached out, as though compelled by some instinct he didn't fully understand. Claire hesitated, but then gently placed the child in his arms. James held the baby awkwardly, his movements stiff and unsure. Yet, as the child nestled into him, a strange warmth spread through his chest. James began again, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked down at the baby, who had stopped crying and was now staring up at him with wide, curious eyes. "I don't know how to do this." Claire's gaze softened. "No one expects you to be perfect, but you have a responsibility to this child. He's your son." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Son. James had spent years avoiding relationships, avoiding anything that might tether him to another person. And now, in the span of a day, his life had been upended by the presence of this tiny, fragile being. One of the officers cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "We'll be in touch regarding the legal aspects, Mr. Whitaker. For now, Child Protective Services will assist with ensuring the baby's immediate needs are met." James nodded numbly as the officers left, leaving him alone with Claire and the baby. She watched him carefully, as though trying to gauge the sincerity of his intentions. "Do you even know his name?" Claire asked gently. James blinked, realizing with a jolt that he didn't. The mother, a woman he had dismissed as a fleeting encounter, had never told him. Or perhaps she had, and he simply hadn't cared enough to remember. "I don't," he admitted, the confession feeling like another crack in the armor he had spent a lifetime building. Claire sighed. "For now, I've been calling him Toby." It seemed fitting. "Toby," James repeated, the name foreign on his tongue. He looked down at the baby again, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and curiosity. Who was this tiny person? What kind of life had he imagined for him before casting him aside? Over the next few hours, Claire remained in the house, helping James navigate the basics of caring for an infant. She showed him how to prepare formula, how to change a diaper, and how to hold Toby without looking like he was afraid the baby might shatter. James fumbled through each task, his frustration mounting, but Claire's patience never wavered. "You're doing better than you think," she said at one point, offering him a small smile. "Babies don't come with manuals. It's a learning process." James didn't respond. He wasn't sure how to articulate the whirlwind of emotions he was experiencing. All he knew was that, for the first time in years, his carefully controlled life felt completely out of his grasp. As the day turned to evening, James found himself alone with Toby. Claire had left with a promise to return the next day, and the silence of the mansion felt deafening. Toby lay in a crib that had been hastily delivered and assembled by the staff, his tiny hands twitching as he slept. James stood over the crib, watching the baby with a mixture of awe and unease. He felt like an intruder in his own home, a stranger to the life that had suddenly been thrust upon him. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered, the words directed as much at himself as at the sleeping child. "I don't even know if I can." But as he looked at Toby, something inside him stirred. It wasn't a sudden epiphany or a grand realization. It was small, almost imperceptible, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time since that fateful morning, James allowed himself to entertain the possibility that he might not be as irredeemable as he had always believed. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to do right by this child. As Toby shifted in his sleep, letting out a soft sigh, James reached down and gently touched the baby's tiny hand. The child's fingers curled instinctively around his, and James felt the flicker grow, warming the cold edges of his heart. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning brought a flurry of activity to James's mansion. Claire arrived early, her demeanor brisk yet warm as she carried a small bag of supplies. James, still groggy from a night of interrupted sleep, greeted her at the door with Toby cradled awkwardly in his arms. The baby had spent most of the night crying, and James's attempts to soothe him had been clumsy at best. "You look exhausted," Claire said, her tone sympathetic but lightly teasing. "Welcome to parenthood," James sighed, stepping aside to let her in. "I don't think I've slept more than 2 hours," he admitted, shifting Toby in his arms. "And I still have no idea what I'm doing." "That's normal," Claire replied, taking Toby from him with practiced ease. The baby immediately stopped fussing, and James felt a pang of both relief and inadequacy. "The important thing is that you're trying." She set Toby in his crib and began unpacking the bag she'd brought, which contained everything from baby clothes to a soft, colorful mobile. James watched her with a mix of gratitude and apprehension. He wasn't used to having someone in his home, much less someone who seemed so at ease in his chaos. Claire noticed his expression and paused, offering him a reassuring smile. "You don't have to figure this all out at once, James. Parenting isn't something you master overnight. It's about showing up, even when it's hard." Her words struck a chord, though James wasn't ready to admit it. Instead, he changed the subject. "What's next? More diaper lessons?" Claire chuckled. "We'll get to that. But first, we need to talk about the future. Have you thought about what you want for Toby?" The question caught James off guard. He had spent so much time reacting to the immediate crisis that he hadn't considered the long term. The idea of raising a child, especially one who would require extra care and attention, felt overwhelming. And yet, the thought of handing Toby over to someone else was equally unthinkable. "I don't know," he said finally. "I just want him to be safe." "That's a good start," Claire said gently. "But safety isn't enough. Toby needs stability, love, and someone who's willing to fight for him." James felt a pang of guilt. He had spent years avoiding emotional entanglements, building a life that prioritized success over connection. But now, faced with this tiny, vulnerable human, he realized how hollow that life truly was. Before he could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. James frowned, not expecting anyone. He opened the door to find a man in an expensive suit standing on the front steps. The man's sharp features and calculating eyes immediately set James on edge. "Mr. Whitaker," the man said smoothly, extending a hand. "I'm Nathan Cole. I represent an organization that specializes in discreet solutions for situations like yours." James stared at him, his unease growing. "Situations like mine?" Nathan nodded, his tone calm and professional. "Raising a child with special needs can be challenging. We work with families to find the best placement options for children who require additional care. James's jaw tightened. You're suggesting I give him up? I'm suggesting you consider what's best for the child, Nathan said, his voice unwavering. We can place him with a family that's equipped to provide the support he needs. Claire appeared at James's side, her expression instantly hardening. And what exactly do you mean by equipped? She asked, her tone icy. Nathan barely glanced at her. Families who have experience with children like Toby. Families who can provide a stable environment. Claire crossed her arms. And you think being shipped off to strangers is a stable environment? Nathan didn't flinch. It's better than being raised by someone who isn't prepared for the responsibility. James felt the words hit him like a blow. For a moment, he considered the man's offer. It would be so easy to hand Toby over, to return to his carefully curated life, and let someone else bear the weight of this responsibility. But then he thought of Toby's tiny fingers curling around his the night before, the way the baby's wide eyes seemed to hold a quiet trust. Could he really abandon him again? No, James said, his voice firm. That won't be necessary. Nathan raised an eyebrow. Are you sure, Mr. Whitaker? This is a significant decision. I'm sure, James said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Toby stays with me. Claire's expression softened, a hint of pride in her eyes. Nathan, however, didn't look pleased. He gave James a curt nod, then turned and walked away without another word. As the door closed, James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Claire placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. You did the right thing, she said quietly. James nodded, though the weight of the decision still pressed heavily on him. I just hope I can live up to it. You will, Claire said confidently. You just have to take it one day at a time. Over the next few days, James threw himself into learning how to care for Toby. With Claire's guidance, he began to navigate the basics of feeding, changing, and soothing the baby. Each small success felt like a victory, and though the challenges were many, James found himself slowly gaining confidence. He also found himself opening up to Claire in ways he hadn't expected. Her unwavering support and genuine compassion reminded him of a time when he hadn't been so guarded, so consumed by ambition. For the first time in years, James began to see the possibility of a life beyond wealth and power, a life defined by connection and purpose. One evening, as James rocked Toby to sleep, he glanced at Claire, who was tidying up the nursery. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice quiet. Why do you care so much? Claire looked up, her expression thoughtful. Because everyone deserves a chance, James. Even you. The words lingered in the air, and James felt a strange sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as irredeemable as he had always believed. The days began to blend together, each one filled with the relentless demands of caring for an infant. For James, the initial awkwardness of handling Toby was gradually replaced by a hesitant rhythm. He still stumbled, still found himself overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of responsibility, but the weight of it no longer felt unbearable. Claire had become a constant presence, her steady guidance a lifeline James hadn't realized he needed. She arrived each morning with a fresh energy that put James's exhaustion to shame, her easy smile disarming even his most cynical moods. Yet, beneath her calm exterior, James sensed a quiet determination, a refusal to let him falter. One afternoon, as Toby napped in his crib, James and Claire sat in the sunlit kitchen, sipping coffee. The mansion, usually filled with an oppressive silence, now hummed with the faint sounds of life. Toby's soft breaths through the baby monitor, the occasional chirp of birds outside. You seem more at ease, Claire observed, breaking the quiet. James leaned back in his chair, the mug warm in his hands. I wouldn't go that far, he said with a faint smile. But I'm adjusting. Claire nodded, her gaze thoughtful. That's all anyone can ask. Parenting isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, even when it's messy. James tilted his head, considering her words. You make it sound so simple. It's not, Claire admitted. But it's worth it. He hesitated, then asked the question that had been circling his mind for days. Why do you care so much about Toby? About me? Even? You don't have to be here. Claire's smile softened, a hint of something wistful in her expression. Let's just say I've seen too many kids lose their chance at a stable life. And I've seen too many adults let their mistakes define them. I don't want that to happen to Toby. Or to you. Her honesty caught James off guard. He had grown accustomed to people who only cared about what they could gain from him. Claire's sincerity was disarming, almost unsettling. Before he could respond, the baby monitor crackled to life, a soft cry emanating from the speaker. Claire stood, placing her mug on the counter. "I'll get him." "No," James said, surprising even himself. "Let me." Claire paused, then nodded, stepping aside as James left the kitchen. He made his way to the nursery, his footsteps quiet on the carpeted floor. Toby's cries grew louder as he approached, a sharp reminder of the little life now so intricately entwined with his own. James entered the room and leaned over the crib, his heart tightening at the sight of Toby's scrunched face, his tiny fists waving in distress. Gently, James scooped him up, cradling him against his chest. The baby's cries softened, then stopped altogether as he nestled into the crook of James's arm. The simplicity of the moment struck James with an unexpected force. He had spent his entire life chasing achievements, accumulating wealth, and building a fortress around himself. Yet, holding Toby, he felt something far more profound, a sense of purpose he couldn't quite articulate. He swayed gently, humming a tune he couldn't remember the origin of. Toby's eyes fluttered closed, his tiny body relaxing into sleep. For the first time in what felt like forever, James allowed himself to breathe, the weight of his past receding, if only for a moment. Later that evening, as James stood in the living room, rocking Toby to sleep once more, the doorbell rang. He frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late for visitors. Handing Toby to Claire, who had just re-entered the room, James moved to answer the door. When he opened it, he was greeted by a face he hadn't seen in years. Standing on the threshold was Victor Hale, a former business associate whose sharp features and slick demeanor were as familiar as they were unwelcome. "Victor," James said, his tone clipped. "What are you doing here?" Victor stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his gaze sweeping over the opulent surroundings. "I heard you've had quite the development in your life," he said, his smile cold. James's jaw tightened. "If you've come to gloat, don't bother. I'm not in the mood." Victor chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver of unease through James. "Relax, James. I'm here to offer you a deal." "I'm not interested," James said immediately, stepping in front of Victor as he made a move toward the living room. "And I don't have time for your games." Victor's smile widened. "Oh, I think you'll want to hear this one. You see, your reputation has taken quite the hit lately. Word gets around. A child out of wedlock? Abandonment? Not exactly the image of a titan of industry." James's fists clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Get to the point." "The point is, I can help make this problem disappear," Victor said smoothly. "I have connections, families who specialize in difficult cases. They'll take the child, no questions asked, and you can go back to living the life you were meant to." James stared at him, disbelief warring with fury. "You're talking about my son." "I'm talking about your freedom," Victor countered. "Do you really think you're cut out for this, James? Be honest with yourself. You've never been the nurturing type." The words hit their mark, stirring doubts James had been fighting since the day Toby entered his life. But as he looked past Victor to the living room, where Claire stood cradling Toby with a protective tenderness, something inside him hardened. "Get out," James said, his voice low but firm. Victor raised an eyebrow. "James," I said. "Get out," James repeated, stepping closer. "And don't come back." Victor's smile faltered, but he didn't argue. With a dismissive shrug, he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. James stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. When he returned to the living room, Claire looked at him with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Who was that?" "Someone I should have cut ties with a long time ago," James said, his voice resolute. Claire nodded, her expression softening. "You made the right choice." James glanced at Toby, who was now fast asleep in her arms. For the first time in a long time, he felt certain of one thing. He wasn't going to let anyone take this child away from him. The mansion was quiet that evening, save for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional murmur of Toby stirring in his crib. James sat in his study, the room dimly lit by the glow of a single desk lamp. Papers were scattered across the polished surface of his desk, contracts, financial reports, and a stack of legal documents regarding Toby's custody. Normally, James would have worked through such paperwork with methodical precision, but tonight his mind was elsewhere. The encounter with Victor had shaken something loose inside him. Victor's words echoed in his mind, feeding the doubts James had been trying so desperately to suppress. He wasn't a nurturing person. He wasn't equipped for this. But as much as those thoughts threatened to consume him, there was another voice, quieter but persistent, that pushed back. A voice that reminded him of Toby's tiny hand gripping his finger, of the way the baby's cries quieted when he was held. Lost in his thoughts, James barely noticed when Claire appeared at the door to the study. She leaned against the frame, her arms crossed, watching him with an expression that was both gentle and probing. "You've been in here for hours," she said softly. "Everything okay?" James glanced up, startled, then sighed. "Just trying to make sense of all this," he admitted, gesturing vaguely at the papers. "It feels like I'm drowning in it." Claire stepped inside, pulling up a chair across from him. "That's normal," she said. "You're dealing with a lot. But you don't have to do it alone." James hesitated, then met her gaze. "Do you really think I can do this? Be a father to him?" Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied him, as though weighing her words carefully. "I think," she said finally, "that you already are. You're here, James. You're trying. That's more than a lot of people can say." James leaned back in his chair, her words sinking in. "What if I fail?" he asked quietly. Claire smiled, a small, reassuring curve of her lips. "Then you pick yourself up and try again. That's what being a parent is." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Then, as if sensing that James needed a distraction, Claire reached for one of the papers on the desk. It was a legal notice, detailing the requirements for James to officially assume custody of Toby. "You're making progress," she said, scanning the document. "This is good." James scoffed lightly. "It doesn't feel like progress." "It is," Claire insisted. "Trust me, I've worked with families in much worse situations. You're doing better than you think." James wanted to believe her, but the doubt lingered. Still, her presence had a way of grounding him, and for the first time that evening, he felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, James woke to the sound of Toby's cries, sharp and insistent. He groaned, rubbing a hand over his face as he sat up. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light across the room. He glanced at the clock. It was barely 5 a.m. For a moment, he considered waiting for Claire to arrive. But then he remembered their conversation the night before, her quiet confidence in his ability to handle this. Taking a deep breath, he swung his legs out of bed and headed to the nursery. Toby was red-faced and wailing when James arrived, his tiny fists flailing. James moved to the crib, scooping him up with a mix of awkwardness and care. All right, he murmured, rocking the baby gently. "What's the matter, huh?" He checked the diaper, grimacing at the smell. "Of course," he muttered, setting Toby down on the changing table. The process was messy and far from smooth, but by the end of it, Toby was clean, and his cries had subsided. James carried him to the kitchen, where he fumbled his way through preparing a bottle. As Toby drank, his wide eyes fixed on James, a strange sense of calm settled over him. In that moment, the chaos didn't feel so overwhelming. It felt manageable. Later that day, as James and Claire worked together to baby-proof the house, the doorbell rang. James tensed, the memory of Victor's visit still fresh in his mind. He exchanged a glance with Claire before heading to answer it. Standing on the doorstep was a woman James didn't recognize. She was middle-aged, with a kind but weary expression and a folder clutched in her hands. "Mr. Whitaker?" she asked. "Yes," James said cautiously. "My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm with Child Protective Services," she said. "I'm here to discuss the custody process for Toby." James stepped aside, allowing her in. Claire joined them in the living room, her presence a steadying force as Margaret began to explain the legal requirements. James listened intently, his determination growing with each word. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as she flipped through her folder. "We conducted a background check, as we do with all custody cases. And we found something concerning—" James felt his stomach drop. "What is it?" Margaret hesitated, then handed him a document. As James read it, his expression darkened. It detailed a financial transaction from years ago, one that tied him to a questionable deal orchestrated by Victor Hale. Though James hadn't been directly involved, his name was listed, and it was enough to raise red flags. "This could complicate things," Margaret said gently. "The court may see it as evidence of instability." James's mind raced. He couldn't let this derail everything. Not now, not when he had come so far. "What can I do?" he asked. "You'll need to provide evidence that you've severed ties with Mr. Hale and demonstrate a commitment to a stable environment for Toby," Margaret said. "It won't be easy, but it's not impossible." Claire placed a reassuring hand on James's arm. "We'll figure this out," she said firmly. James nodded, a new resolve hardening within him. For Toby, he would fight. No matter what it took, he would prove that he was worthy of being this child's father. James spent the next few days in a blur of activity, each moment consumed with resolving the issue Margaret had brought to his attention. The document tying him to Victor's shady dealings was a damning piece of evidence, but James was determined to prove it didn't define him. He spent hours on the phone with lawyers and investigators, retracing every step of his involvement and compiling a record of the actions he'd taken to distance himself from Victor. Claire was by his side throughout, providing support in ways that went beyond Toby's care. She organized files, made calls, and occasionally forced James to take a break when the stress began to overwhelm him. Her quiet strength was a lifeline, and though James didn't say it aloud, he was deeply grateful for her presence. One evening, after Toby had been put to bed, James and Claire sat in the living room, surrounded by stacks of documents and empty coffee mugs. The tension in the air was palpable, but Claire's steady demeanor kept James from succumbing to despair. "This is a lot," James said, running a hand through his hair. "What if it's not enough? What if they take him from me?" Claire set down the folder she'd been reviewing and looked at him. "James, you're doing everything you can. That's all anyone can ask of you. But what if it's not enough?" he repeated, his voice quieter this time. Claire hesitated, then reached across the table to place a hand over his. "Then we'll fight harder. You're not alone in this." The simple reassurance brought a lump to James's throat. He nodded, unable to find the words to express the mix of gratitude and fear that churned inside him. The next morning, James received a call from one of his lawyers. The man's tone was brisk but optimistic as he explained that they had found a way to formally sever any lingering ties between James and Victor. It was a small victory, but it brought a flicker of hope. That hope was tested later that day when Victor himself showed up unannounced at the mansion. James opened the door to find his former associate standing there, a smug grin plastered across his face. "James," Victor said smoothly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I hear you've been busy." James shut the door and turned to face him, his expression cold. "What do you want, Victor?" Victor chuckled, the sound grating. "I'm here to offer you a way out of this mess. You give me what I want, access to the accounts you locked me out of, and I'll make sure this whole custody situation disappears. No questions asked." James stared at him, disbelief mingling with anger. "You're blackmailing me." Victor shrugged. "Call it what you want. I'm giving you an opportunity. Think about it, James. Do you really want to go through all this for a kid you barely know?" The words struck a nerve, but they didn't shake James's resolve. If anything, they strengthened it. He took a step closer to Victor, his voice low and firm. "You don't get to decide what Toby means to me, and I'm done letting you control any part of my life." Victor's grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "You're making a mistake." "No," James said, his eyes narrowing. "I made a mistake trusting you, but I'm fixing it." Victor opened his mouth to respond, but James cut him off. "Get out of my house." For a moment, Victor seemed ready to argue, but something in James's expression made him think better of it. With a huff of annoyance, he turned and left, slamming the door behind him. James stood there for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. When he turned around, he found Claire standing in the hallway, Toby cradled in her arms. She had clearly witnessed the exchange, and her expression was one of quiet pride. "You handled that well," she said, her voice soft but steady. James exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I don't feel like I did," Claire smiled. "Standing up to someone like him takes courage. You're doing the right thing, James." "For Toby." James looked at her, then at the baby in her arms. Toby was awake, his wide eyes gazing at James with a quiet curiosity. The sight filled James with a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever it took, he would protect this child. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation as James and Claire worked tirelessly to ensure that everything was in order for the upcoming custody hearing. Margaret had scheduled a home visit as part of the process, and James was determined to prove that he was capable of providing a stable and loving environment for Toby. When the day of the visit arrived, James felt a mix of nerves and determination. Margaret arrived promptly, her demeanor professional but not unkind. She spent the morning observing James's interactions with Toby, asking questions about his plans for the future, and inspecting the house to ensure it was safe for a child. James answered each question honestly, his sincerity shining through despite his nervousness. He showed Margaret the nursery, the baby-proof living spaces, and the schedule he had developed to ensure Toby's needs were met. Throughout it all, Claire stood by his side, offering quiet support. By the time Margaret left, James felt a cautious sense of relief. Her parting words had been encouraging, though she had reminded him that the final decision rested with the court. That evening, as James rocked Toby to sleep, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The path he had taken to get here had been anything but easy, and he knew the challenges weren't over. But as he looked down at Toby's peaceful face, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. For the first time, James believed that he might be capable of building a life worth living, not just for himself, but for the tiny, fragile human who had come to mean everything to him. The day of the custody hearing arrived sooner than James had expected, and with it came a tension so palpable it seemed to fill every corner of the mansion. The morning light filtered through the grand windows, but it offered little comfort as James stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with shaky hands. His reflection stared back at him, a man who had once been unshakable but now felt exposed in ways he never thought possible. Claire appeared in the doorway, holding Toby in her arms. The baby was dressed in a soft, pale blue outfit that Claire had picked out, and his small face lit up with a smile as he saw James. The sight eased some of the tightness in James's chest. "You ready?" Claire asked gently. James exhaled and turned to face her. "As ready as I'll ever be." She stepped closer, her voice steady and reassuring. "You've done everything you can. Now it's up to them. But no matter what happens, Toby knows you love him." James's throat tightened at her words, and he nodded, unable to speak. He reached out to take Toby from her, holding the baby close as he savored the warmth and weight of his small body. "We'll be okay," he whispered, more to himself than to Toby. The courthouse was a stark contrast to the mansion, its cold, impersonal hallways buzzing with activity. James felt out of place as he and Claire made their way to the designated courtroom, their footsteps echoing on the polished floors. Margaret was waiting for them outside, her expression calm but serious. "Mr. Whitaker," she greeted him. "Are you feeling prepared?" "As much as I can be," James replied, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coiling in his stomach. Margaret nodded, her tone softening. "Remember, the court isn't looking for perfection. They're looking for someone who's committed to doing what's best for the child. Be honest, and let them see the man you've become." Her words lingered with James as they entered the courtroom. The space was small and unassuming, with rows of wooden benches and a judge's bench at the front. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, sat with an air of authority, her sharp eyes scanning the room as the proceedings began. The opposing side, representing Child Protective Services, presented their case first. They outlined the initial abandonment of Toby, the concerns surrounding James's past business dealings, and the challenges of raising a child with special needs. James felt each word like a blow, but he forced himself to remain calm, knowing that his chance to speak was coming. When it was his turn, James stood, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The judge's gaze bore into him, and for a moment, he felt as though the weight of her scrutiny might crush him. But then he glanced at Toby, who was nestled in Claire's arms, and the sight gave him the strength he needed. "Your Honor," James began, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt inside. "I won't deny that I've made mistakes. My life has been defined by ambition and self-interest, and for a long time, I believe that was enough. But when Toby came into my life, everything changed." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "At first, I was overwhelmed. I didn't know how to care for a child, let alone one who would need extra support. But I realized that my fear wasn't an excuse to walk away. Toby deserves a chance at a stable, loving home, and I'm committed to giving him that." James took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "I've taken steps to address the concerns raised about my past. I've cut ties with individuals who don't align with the values I want to instill in my son, and I've worked tirelessly to create an environment where Toby can thrive. I know I'm not perfect, but I'm here, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to be the father he deserves." The courtroom fell silent as James finished speaking. He returned to his seat, his heart pounding as he waited for the judge's response. Claire placed a reassuring hand on his arm, her touch grounding him as the tension in the room mounted. After what felt like an eternity, the judge spoke. Her tone was measured, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Whitaker, this court acknowledges the efforts you've made to demonstrate your commitment to Toby's well-being. Parenting is not about perfection, but about showing up, even when it's difficult. Based on the evidence presented, I find no reason to deny your petition for custody." Relief washed over James like a wave, his breath catching as the words sank in. Claire squeezed his arm, her smile bright and full of pride. Margaret nodded in approval, her expression softening for the first time since the proceedings began. Toby let out a happy babble, and James turned to see him reaching out toward him from Claire's arms. He stood and took the baby, holding him close as a swell of emotion threatened to overwhelm him. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that they were going to be okay. Outside the courthouse, the air felt lighter, as though the weight that had been pressing down on James had finally lifted. He stood with Claire and Margaret, Toby cradled against his chest, as they spoke quietly about the next steps. "You did it," Claire said, her voice filled with pride. "Toby's officially yours." James nodded, his gaze fixed on the baby in his arms. "He's more than that," he said softly. "He's my family." Margaret smiled, her usual professionalism giving way to a rare moment of warmth. "Then take care of him, Mr. Whitaker, and take care of yourself." James watched her walk away, then turned to Claire. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said. "Thank you." Claire shook her head, her smile gentle. "You did this, James. I just helped." As they made their way to the car, Toby let out a happy gurgle, his small hands reaching for James's face. James chuckled, pressing a kiss to the baby's forehead. For the first time in a long time, James felt a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: they would face it together. The weeks following the custody hearing passed in a blur of adjustment and quiet triumph. James, who had once been consumed by business and an obsession with maintaining a perfect image, now found his days revolving around Toby. The sprawling mansion, once a fortress of solitude, was filled with the sounds of laughter, soft cries, and the gentle hum of lullabies that James had memorized from Claire's advice. James quickly discovered that parenting wasn't just about meeting Toby's needs, it was about being present. Whether it was soothing Toby after a bad dream, cheering as he reached for a toy with newfound determination, or simply holding him close as he fell asleep, James found himself cherishing every moment. The small victories, the first time Toby smiled at him, the way his tiny fingers clutched at James's shirt, felt like monumental achievements. Claire continued to be a vital part of their lives. She came by regularly, helping James navigate the more complex aspects of Toby's care and lending her unwavering support. Though their relationship had started out as purely professional, there was a growing warmth between them. Claire's easy laughter, her empathy, and her steadfast belief in James's ability to rise to the challenge had become a source of comfort for him. One afternoon, as Toby napped in his crib, James and Claire sat in the backyard. The early spring sun cast a golden glow over the manicured gardens, and the scent of blooming flowers filled the air. James had insisted on preparing tea, something he had rarely done for anyone in the past, and the two of them sat at the wrought iron table, the atmosphere surprisingly light. "You're getting the hang of this," Claire remarked, her eyes sparkling as she sipped her tea. James chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't give me too much credit. I still feel like I'm one meltdown away from disaster." "That's every parent," Claire said with a laugh. "You're doing better than you think." James leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the house where Toby slept. "I never imagined my life would look like this," he admitted. "If you'd told me a year ago that I'd be raising a child, I would have laughed in your face." Claire smiled softly. "Life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes the things we don't plan for turn out to be exactly what we needed." James looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You've been a big part of that," he said quietly. "I don't think I could have done any of this without you." Claire's cheeks flushed slightly, and she glanced down at her cup. "You give me too much credit. This was all you, James. I just nudged you in the right direction." The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken emotions. Before either of them could say more, Toby's cries broke the quiet. James stood quickly, his instincts kicking in as he moved toward the house. "I'll get him," he said, glancing back at Claire with a small smile. "Stay here. Finish your tea." Inside, Toby was standing in his crib, his little hands gripping the wooden bars as he wailed. James scooped him up, murmuring soothing words as he rocked him back and forth. Toby calmed almost immediately, his small head resting against James's shoulder. "You've got a good set of lungs on you, kid," James said softly, smiling as Toby let out a contented sigh. As he carried Toby back to the backyard, James couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Every day brought new challenges, but it also brought moments like this, moments that made the struggles worthwhile. Later that evening, as James settled Toby down for the night, he found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed. The man he had been, the one who had abandoned Toby on that park bench, felt like a stranger now. James had spent so many years believing that success and control were the only things that mattered, but Toby had shown him a different path, one where vulnerability and love held more weight than any business deal or bank balance. After Toby drifted off to sleep, James walked to his study. He sat at his desk, staring at the blank notepad in front of him. For weeks, he had been grappling with a growing desire to make amends for his past mistakes, not just with Toby, but with others he had hurt along the way. He picked up a pen and began writing, a letter to the woman who had brought Toby into his life. The words came slowly at first, but then they poured out of him. He apologized for the way he had treated her, for his selfishness and cowardice. He expressed his gratitude for the gift she had given him, even if he hadn't realized its value at the time. By the time he finished, the page was filled with raw, unfiltered emotion. James folded the letter carefully and set it aside, unsure of what he would do with it, but feeling a sense of closure nonetheless. The next morning, James woke to the sound of Toby's laughter. He found the baby in the living room, sitting on a soft blanket surrounded by toys. Claire was with him, her smile as bright as the morning sun. "Good morning," she said, glancing up as James entered. Toby decided it was playtime. James grinned, his heart swelling at the sight. It's a good way to start the day. As the three of them spent the morning together, James felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. His world had become smaller in some ways, revolving around Toby and the simple joys of parenthood, but it had also become infinitely richer. That evening, as James put Toby to bed, he lingered by the crib, watching the baby's chest rise and fall with each peaceful breath. He reached down, brushing a gentle hand over Toby's soft hair. "You changed everything," he whispered, "and I'm so glad you did." James left the room, his steps lighter than they had been in months. He found Claire in the kitchen, tidying up after dinner. She looked up as he entered, her expression curious. "Everything okay?" she asked. James nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "Yeah," he said. "For the first time in a long time, everything feels right." They stood there for a moment, the quiet warmth of the moment wrapping around them like a blanket. And in that stillness, James realized that his life, once defined by emptiness, was now filled with something far more meaningful: love, connection, and the promise of a brighter future. The following weeks brought an unexpected rhythm to James's life. Each day began with Toby's laughter or cries and ended with the quiet moments after the baby had fallen asleep. James found himself adjusting to the demands of parenting, no longer with the hesitation of a novice, but with the steady confidence of someone who had embraced the role fully. Claire continued to visit, though her presence began to feel less like a necessity and more like a welcome addition to their lives. She had become a friend, a confidant, and someone who seemed to understand James in a way few others ever had. There was a growing ease between them, a shared sense of purpose that made even the most challenging days feel manageable. One sunny afternoon, as Toby played on a blanket in the backyard, James and Claire sat nearby, watching him with quiet amusement. Toby's attempts to crawl were met with determination, his little hands and knees pushing against the soft fabric as he inched forward toward a brightly colored ball. "He's getting stronger," Claire said, her voice filled with pride. James nodded, his gaze fixed on Toby. "It's amazing to watch him figure things out. He's so resilient." Claire smiled. "He gets that from you." James looked at her, surprised. "I don't think anyone's ever called me resilient before." "Well, they should," Claire replied. "You've come a long way, James. You've built a life for Toby, a good one. That takes strength." James felt a warmth spread through him at her words, but he didn't know how to respond. Instead, he watched as Toby finally reached the ball, letting out a triumphant squeal. James laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded. That evening, after Claire had left and Toby was asleep, James found himself reflecting on how much she had come to mean to him. She had been there through some of the hardest moments of his life, her unwavering support a constant source of comfort. He realized that he looked forward to her visits not just for Toby's sake, but for his own. But with that realization came uncertainty. James had spent so many years closing himself off from others, building walls to protect himself from vulnerability. Allowing someone in, especially someone as kind and genuine as Claire, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. A few days later, as James was preparing Toby's lunch, the doorbell rang. He wiped his hands on a towel and went to answer it, surprised to find Margaret standing on the doorstep. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence immediately set James on edge. "Margaret," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "This is unexpected. I wanted to speak with you," she said, her tone professional. "There's been a development." James's heart sank. "What kind of development?" Margaret hesitated, then handed him a file. "It's about Toby's extended family. We've located a relative, an aunt, who's expressed interest in adopting him." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He stared at the file in his hands, his mind racing. "An aunt?" he repeated. "Why now? Why didn't she come forward before?" "She didn't know about Toby until recently," Margaret explained. "She's his biological mother's sister. She contacted us after learning about the situation." James shook his head, disbelief and panic rising in his chest. "I've worked so hard to give Toby a home. He's safe here. He's happy." Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her expression sympathetic. "I know you've done everything you can, James, and the court will take that into consideration. But they'll also weigh the importance of biological ties." James felt the ground shift beneath him. "What happens now?" "There will be a hearing," Margaret said gently. "The court will determine what's in Toby's best interest. You'll have the chance to present your case." After Margaret left, James sat in the living room, the file unopened on the coffee table. Toby was napping in his crib, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. James's thoughts were a whirlwind of fear, anger, and determination. The idea of losing Toby, of losing the life they had built together, was unbearable. When Claire arrived later that day, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. James explained the situation, his voice shaking with the effort to keep his emotions in check. Claire listened intently, her brow furrowed with concern. "We'll fight this," she said firmly when he finished. "You've proven that you're the best person to raise Toby. The court will see that." James nodded, though his doubt lingered. What if they don't? What if they decide that blood ties matter more than everything I've done for him? Claire reached out, placing her hand over his. "Then we'll deal with it together." "You're not alone in this, James." Her words steadied him, and he felt a flicker of hope amidst the uncertainty. Over the next several days, James threw himself into preparing for the hearing. He gathered letters of support, compiled documentation of Toby's care, and worked closely with his lawyer to build a case that would demonstrate his commitment to being the best parent Toby could have. The night before the hearing, James sat in Toby's nursery, watching the baby sleep. The room was filled with soft moonlight, and the gentle rise and fall of Toby's chest was a soothing rhythm. James leaned forward, brushing a hand over Toby's tiny fingers. "I'm not going to let you go," he whispered. "No matter what happens, I'll fight for you." The hearing was tense and emotionally charged. Toby's aunt, a woman named Lydia, was articulate and poised as she described her desire to give Toby a home with his biological family. James listened to her testimony, his heart aching with the knowledge that she wasn't an unkind person. She genuinely believed she was doing what was best for Toby. But when it was James's turn to speak, he poured his heart out. He described the journey he had been on, the mistakes he had made, the lessons he had learned, and the deep love he felt for Toby. He spoke of the life they had built together, the milestones they had celebrated, and the future he envisioned for them. When the judge delivered her decision, James held his breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The words that followed were a blur, but one phrase stood out. "It is in the child's best interest to remain with Mr. Whitaker." Relief and gratitude surged through James as tears filled his eyes. He turned to Claire, who was sitting beside him, and saw her smiling through her own tears. They had one. Toby was his. As James carried Toby out of the courthouse, the baby let out a happy babble, his little hands reaching for James's face. James laughed, holding Toby close as a wave of emotion washed over him. They had been through so much, but they had come out the other side stronger. For the first time, James allowed himself to believe in the future, one filled with love, family, and the promise of brighter days ahead. The weeks following the court's decision were filled with a sense of peace and joy that James hadn't experienced in years. Toby was officially and unequivocally his, and the weight of uncertainty that had loomed over their lives had finally lifted. Each day felt like a small celebration, a testament to the life they had built together despite the odds. James found himself savoring the little moments. The way Toby's laughter filled the house, the soft weight of him asleep in his arms, the determined way he reached for his toys during playtime. These were the moments that made everything worth it, that reminded James how far they had come. Claire remained a steady presence in their lives, her warmth and kindness a constant source of support. She had been with them through every challenge, and James couldn't imagine their world without her. There was a bond between them now, unspoken but deeply felt, that grew stronger with each passing day. One crisp autumn afternoon, James decided to take Toby to the park. It was the same park where their journey had begun, though the memories of that day now felt distant and surreal. He dressed Toby in a soft knit sweater and bundled him into the stroller, his heart light as they set off. The park was alive with activity, children laughing as they played on the swings, couples strolling hand in hand, and the vibrant colors of the changing leaves painting the landscape in hues of red and gold. James found a quiet spot beneath a towering oak tree, spreading a blanket on the grass before settling Toby down with his favorite toys. As Toby babbled happily, James watched him with a sense of wonder. He marveled at how much his son had grown in such a short time, at the strength and resilience that seemed to radiate from him. Toby had been through so much, yet here he was, full of life and joy. Claire joined them not long after, carrying a thermos of coffee and a bag of pastries. She smiled as she approached, her cheeks rosy from the cool breeze. "I thought you two could use some company," she said, settling down on the blanket beside James. "You're always welcome," James replied, his smile warm. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping coffee and watching Toby play. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the park, and the crisp air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves. It was a moment of quiet perfection, one that James wished he could freeze in time. After a while, Claire turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, James," she said softly. "Watching you with Toby, it's clear how much you've grown. He's lucky to have you." James looked at her, his gaze steady. "I think I'm the lucky one. Toby, he's changed everything for me. I don't even recognize the man I was before he came into my life." Claire smiled, her eyes bright. "That's what love does. It changes us, makes us better." James hesitated, then reached for her hand, his touch tentative but firm. "You've been a part of that too, Claire. I don't know how I would have made it through all of this without you." Claire's cheeks flushed, but she didn't pull away. "You didn't need me, James. You had it in you all along. I just helped you see it." James tightened his grip on her hand, his voice low. "Still, I'm grateful for everything." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. There was an understanding between them, a connection that had grown stronger with time. Before James could say more, Toby let out a delighted squeal, drawing their attention. The baby was holding up a small red leaf, his face alight with wonder. James and Claire laughed, the moment between them shifting into one of shared joy. James reached for Toby, pulling him into his lap as the baby waved the leaf triumphantly. As the afternoon stretched on, James felt a sense of contentment settle over him. The park, once a place of painful memories, had become a symbol of new beginnings. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, the mistakes, the challenges, and the moments of doubt, and felt a deep gratitude for everything that had led to this moment. That evening, after they returned home, James put Toby to bed. He lingered by the crib, watching his son's peaceful face as he slept. The soft glow of the nightlight bathed the room in a warm light, and James felt a surge of emotion. "You've given me everything I didn't know I was missing," he whispered. "I promise to give you the best life I can." As James turned to leave the nursery, he found Claire standing in the doorway. Her expression was soft, her arms crossed as she leaned against the frame. "He's lucky to have you," she said quietly. James stepped closer, his voice earnest. "We're both lucky. You've been there for us every step of the way, Claire." "I don't know how to thank you." Claire smiled, her eyes shining. "You already have, James. Watching you with Toby. That's thanks enough." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "You mean more to us than you know. I hope you'll always be a part of our lives." Claire's smile widened, and she squeezed his hand in return. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As they stood there, the quiet hum of the house around them, James felt a sense of hope for the future. The life he had built with Toby, and the connection he had found with Claire, was more than he had ever dreamed possible. It was a second chance, a testament to the power of love and redemption. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to believe in happiness, not as a fleeting moment, but as something real and lasting. And as he looked at Claire, then back at the nursery where Toby slept, he knew that this was only the beginning. What would you do if life gave you a second chance to right your wrongs? Reflect on James's journey and ask yourself, how far would you go for love and redemption? If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next heartwarming tales we've prepared. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more stories that will move your heart.